And welcome to Savior Destroyer, a panel about the #1 best-selling original fantasy graphic novel, Dark One, by Brandon Sanderson, Jackson Lanzing, Collin Kelly, and Nathangooden. I'm Adrian Wassel, Editor-in-Chief of Vault Comics. I'm joined today by Syndee Barwick and David Dissanayake. If you're looking to learn more about Vault, they hold all the answers. Please connect with them at our US Book Show virtual booth. I'm also, and this is the really exciting part, joined by the Dark One creative team, writers Jackson Lanzing and Collin Kelly, and artist Nathangooden. Dark One is an Amazon and Barnes & Noble bestseller since its release. It's available right now everywhere books are sold. Guys, I thought we could start with some quick little introductions. So Jackson, Collin, Nate, please just introduce yourselves.
Hey, I'm Jackson Lanzing. I'm one half of the Lanzing Kelly hive mind, who have been working in comics, television, film, podcasts, and now prose, though that isn't fully announced, for the last decade or so. Collin and I are a writing team. We've been working together since our early 20s, and yeah, we've just been completely honored to be a part of this project with an author who we both grew up reading, and who's been a huge part of our sort of formative years as writers, and has been just an incredible mentor on this project. We're both based out of LA. That's what I got to say. Collin, spill the rest of the secrets.
Hey, you covered all the highlights. I'm Collin Kelly. I'm the other half of the Kelly Lanzing hive mind. Nothing I can say better except that we've really made it a specialty of ours to work with more established creators in order to establish and bring to life visions. And this project has been a real pleasure to develop, but no more so than because of the amazing artist that we got to work with. Over to you, Nathan.
Hi, Nathangooden, artist of Dark One and one of the founding members of Vault Comics, and illustrated several books such as Barwick, the upcoming series Barwick, my first project with Jackson and Collin, Zojicon, and other such titles as Vampire the Masquerade, Powerless, things like that. It's a long list of projects. So.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. So Dark One is ultimately the story of a chosen one. It's a portal fantasy story in which we meet Paul Tennyson, a young man from our world who is called to a fantasy world, Mirandus. But he's not called to be the savior of the world necessarily. He's called to become the Dark One, the destroyer of worlds. Which is a nice inversion of a really established and well-loved trope. You guys kind of preempted my first question, which was great, about collaboration. So, the first thing that I wanted to kind of ask here is, Jackson, Collin, you're two parts of a hive mind, writer team extraordinaire, career collaborators. This is, as Nate mentioned, your second time teaming up with Nathan on previous project, Zojicon. Was it the case that already being a well-versed writing team helped you when it came time to collaborate with Brandon Sanderson and unpack his rather extensive outline and characters and all the rules that come with building a Sanderson world like Mirandus, particularly in something that feels like a tighter frame, like a graphic novel? You have lots of room, and this is going to be a multi-book series, but was being that hive mind already, kind of a collaborative team, was that helpful here?
Yeah, absolutely. We have an internal term that we like to use, ego death. Because we are a partnership, you cannot be precious about too much. It really becomes a conversation. Every single choice becomes a conversation. So bringing in another voice into that conversation, whether it's Nate or you, Adrian, or in this case, Brandon, is something that we find incredibly stimulating. We love to work within, to answer your question about working within the graphic novel space, we really like to work within a box. And to find that box, we really need to bring forward all of the best ideas possible so that we can start to synergize, synthesize, and find out where the story is really going to live.
It's interesting because I think we kind of fell backwards into it, sort of historically anyway, because we started as collaborators in comics through a collaboration with Alyssa Milano on a book called Hacktivist over at Boom Studios. And that project really came about as a result of, there was a core idea that Alyssa had come to, some character ideas that she'd come to, but there was really a lot of room to grow in it. And it let us sort of sit inside that box and then just generate and generate and generate and come up with all kinds of interesting ideas and flips on the idea and do research, because we're big research nerds, and really just get a chance to like sit and live inside of a space that feels fundamentally safe to create in, because you know that that vessel is going somewhere. It's not just an ephemeral, book that maybe a publisher will pick up. It's like, okay, here's a space that you can actually create in, and at the end of the day, there's going to be a book there. And as people who come from film and TV, where collaboration is the norm, right, where a single author is rare to non-existent outside of a very few key, people, we found that that was a really rewarding experience. Now, doing that with Brandon is a totally different level, because what Brandon has isn't an idea. He has a 65-page document that tells you everything about the world, that tells you the magic system, that thinks through the characters, that tells you about the intentions, the tone, all of these things, right? And then what we got to do was sit there with that 65-page piece and generate and say, okay, well, what if we change this one thing here? And what arenas does that open up? What if you take this kernel of an idea that's just mentioned in one sentence on page 30 and find a way to really turn that into a narrative thrust? There's a character in Dark One named Princess Fiatora. Fiatora is to some degree our foil, and you could even characterize her as kind of a like Darth Vader sort of sub-villain in the term, in sort of the way the book is mechanized. But she's also in many ways her own protagonist. She is to some degree a love interest for Paul. She has several different sort of ways into the story. She probably has about 3 sentences in the 65-page outline that runs down, Brandon's idea for like what a princess of this particular world might be. And we really grasped onto that character and said, okay, we think she's really core to this story. And in building her out and in looking at what she became, in pitching that to Brandon, in getting his feedback, and in growing her into the narrative, we all discovered, between Brandon and us, something new. And then obviously the whole time, Nathan is generating incredible art. I mean, there was art on this book before we ever stepped in. So Nathan is generating the world visually as we're generating the world in words. And so by the end of it, that collaboration creates something that's really singular. And it couldn't have been done by any individual one of us, or even just by the hive mind on our own.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for those answers. It's really illuminating. It's such a tremendous process building something that's massive. And, as a little bit of history here, Jackson, Collin, Nathan are 3 of the most trusted collaborators I know. Some of my oldest friends in comics. And I really don't know that we could have done this project with any other team on the planet. Something this big in scope demanded just that kind of, I think it demanded that kind of familiarity with each other as storytellers. Like if you guys hadn't collaborated previously on ZojaCon, I think there would have just been so much more work than there already was to just crafting something this big. But there's a lot of shorthand that you guys were able to kind of accomplish because you had that communication, hopefully not just with me as series editor, but also with Nathan as your direct collaborator, and then with Brandon. So Nathan, I wanted to pivot and ask you a question here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is your longest comic work yet, and this is just book 1 too. We've got more coming. So when you're starting on such an immense, or when you're staring down such an immense story and world, where do you start as an artist? What's the first thing you explore with your pencil? And then what's the last thing you find comfort with?
Yeah, this is definitely by far the longest project I've done. I haven't had any ongoings or anything. It's been pretty short runs, short arcs. But this is definitely the longest. And it was a challenge. I mean, it was a challenge just to even get the sheer number of pages of story, and just like, where do we start? This is so many characters, so many worlds. Where do we start? And I think for me, it was just finding, no worries. Just finding a style that would allow all of these characters and worlds and everything to coexist. Because we're dealing with 2 very different worlds like colliding. And for me, it was starting there, just like, okay, how do I get this very noir, cityscape to mesh with this fantastical world of Mirandus, and to have them kind of coexist, and the characters be able to walk between worlds. So starting there, and then obviously characters. Like I'm always driven by characters. Like I think, no matter how big or the scope of the story, characters are always going to drive it. And it's something if you can relate to, like every reader can have an entry point into the story. So it was there in developing really unique, kind of quirky characters that the common person could relate to, and find like, okay, Paul is kind of strange around the edges looking, and that's okay, and so is, so are the other characters. They all have their little quirks. And it's like, I think finding that was a good place to start for me, of like, okay, keep this grounded, get entry points for readers.
And if you don't mind me jumping in on that for just a hot second, I want to really underline something Nathan just said, and it comes down to what you said, Adrian, about collaboration and sort of long-term trust, right? We worked with Nathan on Zojicon, which was a very strange book with very strange intentions. It was a book that, to this day, right, it's taught in colleges and sort of thought of as like a really like interesting sort of like quote unquote literary graphic novel, but it's also half the people who pick it up are like, I don't know what is happening. Like it is very much a it is a divisive book in its own way, not because people I think hate it, but because it's reaching for something very different than most comics and most fantasy is. What we learned as part of that process was that Nathan was capable of bringing humanity to very abstract and very interesting and very weird situations, and that you could trust him with not just sort of the transition of tone, but transition of time and of civilization and of structures and of, Zojicon takes place over the course of millennia, and yet it feels like a very intimate story. And so that was something that when we came onto Dark One, we knew. So we could just immediately say, okay, great. In our first few pages, we've got Paul, and we have his imaginary sister, Nika, who he sees in his mind, who's sort of the symptom of his mental illness, which is a big through line throughout the book. Is Paul suffering from mental illness, or is he the chosen one of Mirandus, or is he both? Are those two things not necessarily mutually exclusive, which was a big part of our interest in this project. That was very interesting for us because we could put humor in Nika right away. Nika could be funny and goofy and a little broad and a little bigger and a little more of like a quote unquote comic book character. And she didn't break the realism of the story because Nate knows how to sell that. There's a page pretty early in the book where they're just walking away from Paul's therapy, and Nika is appearing hanging on lampposts and like appearing behind him and is sitting on the top of cars and is just like making funny jokes. And she livens the story up immediately, where the story could have been very sort of dark and sinister from the get-go, which for a book like Dark One might have felt appropriate, but also I think would have felt oppressive, especially at the beginning of an over 200-page journey. We really wanted you to buy into the humanity and the joy of these two characters, not just the darkness of them. And so that, I remember when we got those pages, particularly, which was really early in the process, I remember kind of exhaling because it was like, okay, this is going to work. Like we knew Nathan was going to make it work. Like he's incredible. We jumped at this project because we heard Nate was drawing it, and it was like, okay, well, we're in. But this was a really awesome opportunity to just see, okay, this is going to work. This is going to be funny. It's going to be human. It's going to be strange, even while it is very much a sort of straightforward inversion on a portal fantasy. So yeah, I think that having that trust in Nate and knowing that he could pull that off meant we could write it. If we hadn't, I don't know if we would have had the courage to try to blend genre and tone the way that we did in the book.
And to handle that with such an immense cast, because I mean, you've mentioned Fiatora and Paul and Nika, but then we have so many other characters. I mean, we have Valerian and Rastic, who is a character from an entirely different species, not even human. And then, we've got Caligo, our terrifying villain who straddles, two worlds. We have Lynn, Paul's mother, who's an incredibly important part of narrative, sort of a linchpin, really, of the story. So softball question to you, Nate, then, you know, getting to draw all of these characters in this huge cast, is there anyone that you just gravitated to most of all? Like, was there a character that just became your favorite to draw?
Feotora, Princess Feotora. She is such a cool character, and just that attitude of no one's going to stop me from doing what I want to do. And, you know, not to give no spoiler alert, not to, you know, when she challenges a certain somebody to a duel, and it's just like, but yeah, I gravitate to her just because it's something that, like, we, you know, it's a character that, like, we all can relate to, like, at some point in our life, of like, what am I doing? You know what I mean? Like, what are we doing here? What am I doing? Like, is this all there is for me? And it's something we all go through at some point. And I think that I just really latched onto that. Second runner up, I would say Lynn. Just that tough mom that we all love, you know, just that tough mom. Like,
yeah, it's cool to hear you say Feotora, because I think that goes to your point, Jackson and Collin, about that synergy. Immediately you latched on to that character, Nate latched onto that character, you know, you came back to Brandon with a whole idea for this character that was in the outline but hadn't kind of taken that spotlight, and then together, you know, you guys built this character who is vital to the story. Paul wouldn't be the same character without Feotora as foil. So much of what we learn about him is what we learn about her. You know, I think there's kind of a rule that I take to editing, which is if you want people to care about a character, you have to have other characters care about them. And Feotora is a really interesting example of that, because how and why she cares about Paul is in direct tension with the quote unquote narrative, which is going to be my next question. But real quick, it looks like we have some live attendees, and I just wanted to note that if anybody wants to type in the chat questions, thoughts, feedback, please feel free. We can address it at the end. And so, yeah, I just wanted to note that. But yeah, as far as the narrative is concerned, Sanderson's worlds always have a rule system and a magic, and unpacking and unveiling that is like half the fun, right? You know, you read the Stormlight archives and you know that by book 10, if we get, you know, when we get out, however far we go in the Stormlight archives, it's going to be a totally new, your understanding of that magic system is going to be totally new. It's going to be so different than where you started on page 1. And this rule applies here with Mirandus and with this mechanism, the narrative. And I'm not asking you to unpack and reveal where we end up, because that's the joy of reading. But where do we start? What is the narrative, and what does it mean to the world of Mirandus? Because ultimately, Dark One is also a book about storytelling.
Yeah, the narrative is the fundamental guiding principle of Mirandus. It is a core to their culture, to their politics, to every single thing they do. It's the fundamental idea, effectively, that that heroism and that what the signs of right and good will triumph, right? You will strive and you will be challenged, but in the end, it will be good that prevails. And that is the fundamental story that the people of this culture, this people of this world tell themselves. And by and large, it has proven to be true.
It's interesting because what that narrative does as a central point is sort of twofold, right? And this comes directly, this is I think the core concept from Brandon's initial outline. It's on page 1. You know, the narrative is our way of reflecting traditional fantasy storytelling. The idea that the destined one will rise and the dark one will rise to meet him, and the two of them will fight, or it's really the dark one will rise, the destined one will rise to meet him, the two will fight, the destined one will win, and then the cycle will continue, right? Just as fantasy novels have continued ever forward from Tolkien beyond, right? That this is the narrative we just keep telling ourselves over and over and over again, and that it gives us a sense of safety, and it gives us a sense of space. And what Brandon did that I thought was really genius was that it took that idea of that safety that we all find in fantasy and turned it into a rule set that said, that's not just safety, that is a rule set. That is fundamentally set in stone. What if you're on the other side of that rule set? What if you're the dark one? Well, that rule set suddenly doesn't look quite so good, does it? It feels a little bit less like a safety blanket and a little bit more like a dictatorial, fatalist oppression that's being set upon you. And then you start to think about what that means for orcs. In this case, we call them Droll. And Droll aren't orc one-to-one, but they have a lot of similarities in some ways to like sort of the traditional fantasy, quote unquote, dark race, right? And I know there's been a lot of conversation about the way that narratives function for characters like that for orcs. And we thought what a wonderful opportunity to really have that discussion in narrative. And that was, again, that was the core genius of Brandon's pitch for Dark One, was let's take the meta conversation about fantasy tropes and about how fantasy tropes are inherently, can inherently sometimes be racist and sexist and classist and really involve a lot of our sort of initial assumptions about ourselves and about our societies, the way we tell narratives in our own world, and then reflect that back as actual world building and storytelling and magical systems that our characters can grapple with directly. And so inherently, the book becomes a little bit more of a sort of meta statement on fantasy, even as it doesn't have to sit there and talk about fantasy. Never does anyone or character sit down and go, so you know how in fantasy books this happens? Like, that doesn't need to happen. Nobody needs to have a metatextual conversation because they are embedded in the meta narrative. That's their core struggle. So it all becomes very personal and very real. And even conversations about this that explain the narrative are couched in very personal conversations between people like Theotora and Paul, where they are trying to come to a cultural and sort of personal understanding just between two people over a fireplace. It has way less to do with learning something or a campfire. It has less to do about learning the rules of the world and more about creating a conversation between these characters, which is, I think, what Brandon's rule sets from Mistborn Beyond tend to do for his stories as well, and was the thing that we were really excited to anchor in on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that tees up a question for Nate that I have. Real quick, I just wanted to mention, Corey, I got your question in the chat and I'll make sure to ask it at the end in a bit. And it looks like we have some more live attendees. So just another reminder, if you want to ask questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. So Nathan, the question that occurs to me in this, after hearing Jackson and Collin explain the narrative as a mechanism for the kind of magic system of the world, the rules that we're going to unpack, and that readers are going to sort of pull layers back on, is when you went into the story and had to design and create this world, knowing that there's this intense duality, how did that inform your decisions and decision making when it came to things like portrayal of Rastic? You know, he is part of this Droll, which Jackson has just clearly outlined as, you know, meta commentary on like the orc, the quote unquote dark race from so many fantasy tropes, and that's a lot to unpack. And how we meet Rastic and what we eventually learn about Rastic are there's a very, very different kind of experiences as readers. So I wanted to just give you an opportunity to talk about your influences visually and the decision making you had to do to portray that duality, to make the bad guys the good guys and the good guys the bad guys all at once.
Yeah, I you know, specifically with the Droll, I didn't want to. These are the bad. You don't look at them and go, oh, they have fangs, they have big giant muscles. They are the brutes. Yeah, they are the strength. You know, they're the orcs of this world. Like, I didn't want that. I didn't want there to be, because they aren't that. You know, in a way, they aren't that, and they're supposed to be sympathetic. You know, you're supposed to look at them and be like, oh man, like, you know, even though some of them do have giant muscles that bulging out of the, you know, and but like at the core of it, they're not that. And so I think building this world took a little bit of, I'm trying to think of the right words. It took a little bit of care and understanding both sides of everything, you know, kind of looking at a war of being like, okay, what's okay, but why are they fighting, and why are they fighting? And in their minds they're right, in their minds they're right. So it's kind of finding the humanity, for lack of a better word, finding the humanity in both sides. And as far as like style wise, for me, everyone that knows me knows, like, for me, the first time I saw a Frazetta painting, I knew what I want to do for a living. I saw a Frazetta painting, I saw a Death Dealer 4, and I was like, yep, that's what I'm doing this for a living. So I always kind of start there, because that was what brings me back to like the first ever like excitement I got from just seeing a picture of like, okay, I just so many different questions I have about this Death Dealer character, like what's under the mask, and like you can kind of tell what goes on in my design work from Dark One is kind of a similar thing of like when you see the armor, it's like, well, what's under that armor? I can't really tell. And that armor is kind of evolving as this person's maturing, that armor is kind of maturing, and it's like you're kind of playing with the mystery of the magic, which is there's enough coming. There's enough in this first book, but there's a lot more answers coming in the subsequent books, explaining kind of the visuals.
Though I think it's really what you just said about like the mystery of magic. That can be the thing that when you do build out these rule sets, as Brandon obviously is well known for, part of what that can do is demystify the magic. And something that we were really interested in doing with Dark One, and that I think you just nailed every time you deal with the magic, is to create something that felt fundamentally primal. Because if the narrative feels like it is something that makes a lot of sense and just locks in, and that like there are people behind it and it has all this motivation and there's all these sort of reasonings behind it, at some point or another, it becomes less oppressive. It becomes more of a thing that you can thwart. And the core sort of the core mystery of the narrative and the way that it has wrapped Mirandus around its finger and just run this story forever feels really, the more mysterious that is, the more it is beyond our ken, the more that when Paul does engage with it directly, or Fiatora does engage with it directly, the more stakes that those moments take on. I liken it to like the Force, when the Force is sort of demonstrated as more of the way that Yoda sort of demonstrates the Force in Empire, right? Where it's less about this idea of like, okay, well, here are all the rules and here's how it all works. And it's a little bit more like, yeah, you're going to interact with this very primal thing and it's going to make some decisions about you and you're going to make some decisions about it, but you're not going to understand it and it might not understand you. It's just, you're a person and it is the universe, And I think there's something really cool about that.
Absolutely. And I think, Nathan, your character designs, even like Paul's armor convey that sense of sort of deepening mystery. I mean, he literally goes to a well to awaken, right? And so there's this idea that like the farther down he reaches into it, the more it's going to change him. And we see that in his visual representation when he kind of dons the Dark One armor. So it looks like we're coming up against time, and we've got a question here. It's kind of a series of it's a bit of a nested question. The first one is basically, is Dark One part of the Cosmere? And I'll preempt the answer and before I hand it off, saying no, it's not. It is not part of the Cosmere. It's a standalone story, and that I think is part of what is so exciting about Dark One, is that it is very much a kind of counterpoint to a lot of the stuff that Brandon's exploring in the Cosmere. It's almost like a key to storytelling itself. So the question that ends up the kind of last question in the sequence was, what has it been like to write in that deep space? Well, this isn't Cosmere. So what I want to ask is, Jackson, Collin, what is it like constructing a story like Dark One with Brandon, with Nathan, where that it's going to always be sort of a mirror to something like Cosmere? And what was it like exploring some of those same tropes, but maybe taking a different angle because you weren't bound by that rule system? Collin, I think you're muted.
I think I was muted. I think he was muted. I think we were all muted. Let me just start up with just like a basic thesis, because I think it's worth saying based on what we were saying earlier. You mentioned earlier that, Dark One feels like a story about stories. And I always feel like I'm being a little argumentative when I reply to that question, but I genuinely believe it. Like, it is, but if we thought about the story as a story about stories, it never would have gotten done. What Dark One is a story about characters. It's a story about people dealing with that fundamental question that Nate brought up earlier of, is this all there is for me? Is my life just a series of panic attacks and hallucinations and trips to my psychiatrist? Is life a series of parades and coronations and and duels and hearings with my kingly father? Is life a series of, for Lynn, right, who is a lawyer who's dealing with kind of a B plot throughout this whole thing that kind of stealthily ties into the whole story, is life a series of moral compromises to get me to a place that allows me to make some money, right? Is that all life is? Or is there a larger narrative at play that is moving that along that I can influence and be a part of? And I think that we always had to look at it as a story about those people and the crises they were going through, less the idea, literally to the point that we have a villainous character named Crisis. And that's not like, oops, we made a mistake, right? Like, that's very intentional, because everyone is dealing with this crisis of faith in their own life as they're understanding that their world functions differently than they believe. So fundamentally, we didn't have a terrible lot of questions or conversations about Cosmere outside of the early stages of it, because once we stepped away from that, stepped away from the idea of like a story about stories, we really just tried to focus on this being a story about these people going through what they're going through.
But what we can say is that us as writers are highly influenced by the Cosmere, and knowing the depth that Brandon approaches all of his storytelling really gave us free rein to dive deep, because we knew that Sanderson fans are the kind of fans who deconstruct and appreciate and desire to hunt down information. So when we were writing Dark One, we didn't need to spoon feed anything, and we didn't need to talk down to our audience, because maybe for the first time, or one of the first times in our careers, we know that the fans who pick up the book will be able to elevate themselves to really start to dive in. And if you're deep reading, you will find echoes of the Cosmere in this book. But once again, because we are so influenced by Brandon, and his work is such a broad and deep well of information, that we really couldn't avoid looking at it as we told this story.
It is bizarre the degree to which our own narrative in terms of walking into Brandon's world feels like Paul's a little bit. But it was like, all right, man, like, you're going to get your footing, and then you're going to revisit Mistborn and Stormlight Archive, and you're going to think about what those stories meant to you, and then you're going to be lost in the wilderness for a little bit, and some things are going to try to eat you.
A map.
Yeah. Like, we definitely felt like Paul to some degree. And then by the end of the story, there we are reaching into the well, activating the armor, and feeling like we've really taken some ownership over the story, which is a very hard thing to do when Brandon's name is above the masthead. That's not really a complaint. That's just a truth, right? That when Brandon Sanderson's name is right there, and you're being tasked with writing the thing, physically building it, making it work, writing every panel, writing every line of dialogue, writing a good portion of the plot, but Brandon's name is going on all of this, you really do feel like you have to live up to a certain vibe and a certain sort of feel and a certain voice. And at some point, we really had to understand that we were bringing our own voice to that project as well, and that we had to really embrace our own instincts in this story, as well as Brandon's, and to make it not a situation where we are sort of ghostwriting but in name only, but rather a story where we were fundamentally having a conversation with Brandon and his bibliography, which is a scary thing to do when you are us and don't have nearly that extensive bibliography of work to sort of stand on. So it was a blast.
But if you think it feels good to have a #1 best-selling book on your hands, just imagine what happens when you send in pages and then you hear back from Brandon Sanderson, hey, this is really good.
Yeah.
I can say from my perspective, series editing here, my job is, twofold as an editor, always keeping the trains running on time and then being something of like a liaison, a creative liaison, right? I'm supposed to be your first line of defense, but I'm also supposed to be able to kind of help channel information, ferry information over from one place to another, make sure everybody's hearing the same thing, working together in unison on something collaborative. And the most rewarding part of this experience for me has been that collaboration that you were talking about, Jackson, and being able to, really make a round table rather than a square table. There's nobody sort of sitting at the head of this. It was a round table, and it was really nice to see that collaboration come so naturally and to reinforce itself so well. Obviously, we've all worked on a million other projects, and we can all say they don't always go that way. And for this project, which is so big and so vast and has so many incredible teammates, because we also have Kurt Michael Russell on colors and Darren Bennett on letters, have so many folks all contributing to this, and for it to never ever feel like it's getting pulled even an inch off the path by anyone, but instead everyone's pushing it forward in the same direction is it's an editor's dream, and a testament to your guys' work. So I think we're up against time. I think that's everything for today. I just want to remind attendees to please go to our virtual booth, poke around. There are a lot of cool videos and lots of cool downloadable stuff, including a wallpaper and bookmark for Dark One. Please check out Dark One. It's available right now everywhere books are sold. It is a #1 bestseller, and there are, as Collin and Jackson I think mentioned earlier, maybe it was before the recording started, but there's a great Barnes & Noble exclusive cover that comes with a really cool map of Mirandus that we had a lot of fun kind of collaborating and making with Isaac, who's the map maker. It's been a really fun, so yeah, there's another person on the team. So it's a lot of folks to bring together a graphic novel series of this size. So yeah, please check it out. And thanks everybody for attending. Jackson, Collin, Nathan, thank you so much. Thank you guys.